Hey everybody, Mr. Hughes here, down in Hughes Studios, bringing you a very quick tutorial on how to use the brush tool in Photopea. It works very similar if you're using Photoshop, but I said we keep it quick, so let's do that. So I'm going to create a new file. The size of this doesn't matter because we are simply learning how to use the brush tool, so we're not creating something that's going to be used later on. So to do this, what you're going to do is you're just going to very simply grab the brush tool, which is sitting right here where my cursor is, and you can do that by either clicking on it or pressing the letter B as a shortcut on your keyboard, and then you're going to want to choose the color that you want to use. So right down here, you're going to notice the top color. You can choose whatever you want. So if I chose more of an orange color, and then I can just start painting. Now that's the basics of it. It's pretty simple, but you can get a little bit more complex. So let's do that and talk about what settings you can use. And I'm just going to undo that. The next thing we can do is work with some of the brush properties. So there's two ways to bring up the properties. You can either look for the brush properties here on the right hand side, and if you don't see that, if that window's not there for you, by simply going to Window, Brush, you can bring up that same palette. Now you can see here, there's the color that I chose that I wanted to use, and you can certainly change that again if you wanted to. So if you want to go to blue, let's just do that. Boom, there it is. You've got different styles for your brush sitting here. So you'll notice here we can either have a perfectly round brush, we could get something that's a little bit more flat and use it, whatever you want. There's some presets there that you can manipulate. So let's work with the round brush. The one thing I can do that I would want to play around with is probably the size. This might be a little bit smaller of a brush and you want something bigger. So there's two ways that you can increase or decrease the size of your brush. You can simply grab that slider and drag it up and down. Or what you can use as a shortcut on your keyboard are the square brackets. So right by your enter key, you're going to see a left and right square bracket. And the right one will make your brush larger. So I got to get out of the brush palette here to really show you how that works. So if I come over here and press the right brush palette, notice it gets, or right bracket, it gets bigger. And when I press the left one, it gets smaller. So that is how you can increase and decrease the size of your brush, either with the slider or the shortcuts. I'm going to just undo everything we've done here because I want to clean this up a little bit. Now inside this brush palette, we've got the size, you've got the angle as well. Now if you've got a perfect circle, that angle really isn't going to do anything because if you rotate a circle, it stays a circle. But if I took something like one of these flat brushes here and I drag along, notice that it's completely vertical. But I can change the angle to something that's closer to 90 degrees, and notice now it's going to be horizontal. So you can change the angle of it. You can change the roundness of it, which is from perfect circle to more of a flat pancake. You can change the hardness of it. Now the hardness of it is something I use quite a bit, and it basically means how see-through, kind of how much do you want it to blend with your design. So if I grab a brush here, and let's increase the size a little bit so you can really see the difference here. And I've got a hardness of 100%. And you'll notice, I'm just going to click once and not drag, and notice wherever the circle is, it's either going to be painted or it's not. If the circle covered it, it's at 100%, so it gets covered with paint. If I bring the hardness down to 0%, watch what's going to happen. It gets a little bit smaller. It looks like the brush is smaller, but watch what happens here when I click. Do you see how you have basically kind of 100% in the middle and then it blends, it kind of fades away at the end? So think of a brush when it kind of starts running out of paint, where you kind of smear it a little bit, where you still get some, some paint, but then it kind of fades away by the end of it. So here's a really soaked paintbrush. This one here is a little bit less. So I can also take that. Let's give you an idea here. What happens if we go to about 50%? So if I take 50% and I'll put that one right in the middle. So there you go. You can see there's a hardness of 100% on the left, 50% in the middle, and 0% on the right. And it's just a nice way of blending it into the background. Undo all of those just real quick. The next thing you can play around with is the spacing. So if I grab this circle, I don't know if I can, I'll probably make it easier if I make it a little bit bigger so you can really see it. So it's spacing each circle. Do you notice how it kind of jumps a little bit before the next one comes up? So it has some spacing there. If I increase the spacing, now I'm kind of doing this polka dot sort of effect. Notice that the dots don't show up, and you'll see it if I go a little bit smaller, a little bit better. Notice how the dots don't show up until I drag a little bit more. Now realize you can always go back to your preset by simply clicking on it. So when you start changing numbers, like if I bring the spacing up to 300 and click on this preset again, it goes back to normal. And that is really how you can play around with the brush. The last thing I would mention are these values up here. So notice when I click the brush here, this palette came up. Blend mode we'll talk about in a later tutorial, but I can bring the opacity down as well. And these are a couple things you can play around with. So I could use my brush and go across like that. Watch if I bring the opacity down and I drag, it becomes more see-through. Okay, so those are a couple things that you can, or one of the things you can play around with. And the flow is kind of like if it's an airbrush, how much do you want it to kind of pump out of the airbrush? So think about it, if you were using an airbrush on the screen right now, if that's 100%, that paint's really going to fly out. By bringing the flow down a little bit, it's not going to come out as strong. You can see what kind of happens here, the difference. Right? Do you see how you get kind of different splatters by bringing the flow down? So again, you've got your brush, your color. You can bring up the palette by choosing Window, Brush, or clicking Brush here on the right-hand side. You've got some settings here that you can play around with and try out. And then you can certainly play around with the opacity and flow. And that is the brush in Photopea.